we have certain breaking news. This is worth mentioning because it's 23 days until the West Australian election, and you've looked at the Facebook pages of the two opponents. Well, Mark McGowan's page is active, but the opposition leader, Zach Kirkup's page, is not. So that does provide an imbalance in terms of news dissemination, and this is happening right in the middle of an election campaign in Western Australia. Let's go live back to Canberra now. Michelle Rowland is a Shadow Communications Minister. Michelle, you're obviously pretty concerned about what's happened overnight. That's just one example from WA that goes beyond news and into some of those Facebook pages that can't be classified as news. In fact, they're official pages, whether it's government or other.
It is very disturbing, Laura, and I note that there are even, as you alluded to, emergency services pages that have been blocked, which wouldn't be classified as the sort of public interest journalism that was ever intended to be caught by the code and this legislation. So I think Australians should be rightly outraged by what is happening on that front. Now, whether or not that's some sort of software error or whether that was an intentional is really by the by. The fact is that it is happening now, and those consequences are being felt now. And if this is about protecting our democracy by having a strong fourth estate, our democracy also appears to have been threatened in exactly the way you describe.
Has Facebook gone too far?
This is, I think, the question on everyone's lips. I think there's two parts there. Firstly, when Facebook started out, you remember it was about networking with friends, sharing some photos, not really a news service, and I'm sure no one ever really envisaged that some 40% of Australians would be accessing their news via search and social media in the year 2021. But the other thing too we need to remember is that technologies evolve and they come and go. You might remember a time when we all had MySpace, we all used Internet Explorer, they've gone by the by. There's been much analysis done of whether or not Facebook becomes a much diminished product and a less compelling space to be if news is removed. Australia is the first place in the world where this is occurring, so we're literally a petri dish for this. But I think above all that, we need to keep our eyes on the prize. Remember that we need to have a strong and sustainable public interest journalism sector in Australia, and that means landing a workable code.
Yep, and we don't have that workable code when it comes to Facebook. For Google, it has been workable. It's been suggested this morning that Facebook, with its enormous market power in Australia, is just being a corporate bully. Do you agree?
Well, therein lies the whole problem. They have been identified as having market power. That was the whole point of the ACCC's inquiry. And even as the submissions pointed out, I think News Corp identified it perfectly to say they were unavoidable trading partners thanks to their extreme market power. We have seen deals done outside of legislation being effective, and they have been with Google, obviously, and they've been publicised in the last couple of days. But for Facebook, that does not appear to be the case. And yet again, I point out that it is incumbent on this government to get back into the room. They have been talking a lot about the discussions they have been having on a global scale with these tech giants to deliver outcomes. They need to deliver a workable code that is going to ensure that Australian consumers and news media benefit as a whole.
OK, well, we know the code is there. Labor did support this piece of legislation in principle. I believe it's passed through the House of Representatives, but is Labor now wanting to re-look at this after the events of this morning?
Well, we don't know we did let it go through last night through the House. We did support it, as we always said we would support a workable code through the House of Representatives. Even though there were many questions that were unanswered, we had stated from the outset that we would support this legislation in the House. Now, we don't know what is going to be presented when it gets to the Senate. I was observing Josh Frydenberg's comments earlier, and he was very circumspect, and I think he has left the door open to perhaps something different going before the Senate. So I think the short answer is we actually don't know what is going to be put up in the Senate to know what Labor is going to do there. But at all times, I reiterate that Labor supports the principles that are enshrined in this project, and we support a workable code and will continue to do so.
So when it gets to the Senate, do you reserve your right to perhaps even consider new amendments that you hadn't considered before this morning?
Well, we've always said we don't think that this is the kind of legislation where it's optimal to be amending it on the floor of the parliament. We would prefer the government to reach out to us, as I'm sure they would do across the Senate, as is the case when these matters arise, and ensure that we have something that is workable. And again, we're not in the room, Laura. The Treasurer and the Prime Minister have been involved in these commercial discussions that have been the background for a lot of these negotiations. So it is our hope that the government will reach a position which will ensure that this impasse is overcome, and we have a piece of legislation that can receive cross-party support when it gets to the Senate and be resolved for the benefit of news media and Australians.
In what situation, Michelle, do you think it's okay that a company like Facebook pulls the page of New South Wales Health, the health pages, in the middle of a global pandemic? I mean, that can't just be oversight. That is undermining what's going on here.
It's not okay, and I would even describe it as irresponsible. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, and as I said, people obtain their information more and more through online means. You would normally have someone going through a search engine or through their Facebook news feed in order to find out what is going on, many times before they go to a primary source. That needs to be recognised. So I think it is extremely disappointing, and I would hope that if this is an error, that Facebook rectifies it immediately, and if it is not an error, that it still rectifies it immediately and ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Michelle, Facebook obviously earns a lot of money here in Australia, billions upon billions, as it does right around the world. Many Australian businesses advertise. I think even the government uses Facebook to advertise. Would you suggest that that be rethought?
Look, I think that's early days here. I think that we should still keep our minds focused on having a workable code that does what it was always intended to do. But I can certainly appreciate why many Australians today who've woken up to the news of this would be very angry. They would be very angry not only in terms of a denial of the kind of services that they're used to having, but again, I think it points to the fact that these platforms are always evolving. Australians deserve the very best. We deserve the best in terms of digital technology. We deserve the best in terms of the kind of innovations that the global giants have brought to bear on Australian society and on global in our global economies. But at the same time, they are not above the law. And whilst on one hand they are motivated obviously by profit, on the other hand they have developed to a point where there is, I believe, some sort of inherent social responsibility to do the right thing.
Absolutely, and we haven't seen that this morning, particularly with those critical information pages. Michelle Rowland, always great to have you on the program. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.